The meeting was supposed to seal an 11-month, 9-digit deal. Instead, Helios Dynamics Translator called in sick 90 minutes before the French delegation arrived. Panic spread through glass and leather until a janitor's daughter with a mop bucket and a linguistics major stepped into the doorway and said, "I can help." What followed wasn't just a rescue. It was the moment a CEO who built his empire on control met a woman who spoke the language of power and truth better than anyone in the room. And nothing about Helios or Damian Hart would sound the same again. Damian Hart always prepared for the worst, but he didn't prepare for this. He had built his reputation on precision, on meeting rooms that smelled faintly of cedar and old leather, on calendars that ticked with the cold rhythm of a metronome, on elegant contingencies layered like silk beneath every conversation. He planned for markets, for board votes, for regulatory flare-ups. He did not plan for the translator to send a text at 8:17 a.m. that read, "Stomach flu, can't make it, so sorry," with a concerned emoji that looked like it was apologizing for a lost empire. His head of legal, Priya, stared at the screen as if willing the message to unsend itself. His COO, Harold, rubbed both hands over his scalp and said a sequence of words that someone would probably transcribe into a lawsuit if a camera had been running. The French delegation would be upstairs at 9 sharp, to discuss the final conditions of a joint venture. Helios Dynamics had spent 11 months and 9 digits of patience constructing. And the one thing Damian knew he needed, the one person he needed, had vanished into a bowl of chicken broth somewhere west of Jersey. "Postpone," Harold said, already dialing. "We'll say an emergency. We won't say anything." Damian lifted a hand, and the room obeyed. The skyline behind him bristled with winter light, Manhattan cut in steel and glass and promise. "We start on time." "With who?" Priya's voice was even, but the vein at her temple pulsed. "They brought their own counsel. They'll speak French among themselves, switch to English when it benefits them, switch back when it doesn't. If we miss a subjunctive, we'll be guaranteeing indemnities our grandchildren can't outrun." "We can patch in a remote interpreter," Harold said, a fraction too hopeful. "And feed proprietary terms over a public line," Priya shot back. "Sinael will love that." "Find me someone," Damian said. "Anyone reputable, anyone we can trust." "Our trusted anyone is in bed with a thermometer," Harold replied. "We don't need trust," Damian answered, too quickly. "We need competence." He didn't register the soft squeak of wheels in the hallway. He didn't hear the bucket slosh or the plastic lid click on a container someone had packed with worry at dawn. He was busy running calculations behind his eyes and seeing numbers come up bad. "Excuse me," a voice said, careful and tentative. "Did you say you need a translator?" 4 faces turned. The girl, young woman, early 20s, stood half in the doorway, paused there out of instinct more than shyness, a tote bag slung across one shoulder, an ID badge hanging from a lanyard that wasn't Helios blue. She wore a gray sweater too big for her, sleeves pushed to the elbows, and her hair was braided back in a way that made focus look elegant. Beside her, a yellow mop bucket gleamed like a misplaced sun. "This is a private meeting," Harold said, too brusque. "I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to listen." The woman lifted the tote a little. "I'm here to bring lunch to my dad. He's on the crew for 24. B, the elevators down the hall. One's been sticking. I heard you say French." She tightened the strap across her shoulder, like a promise. "I can help." It would have been funny an hour ago. It would have been the kind of desperate humor people reached for when the universe tugged their ties loose. Priya drew breath, to be kind, maybe, to decline it gently, but Damian beat her to it. "Name." The word came out like a key hitting a table. "Ida," she said, steady now that she'd crossed the threshold. "Ida Diop." "And you speak French." She smiled, not coy, not boasting, something like a small truth closing a latch. "Better than English," she said. "Where are you from?" Harold asked skeptically. "Washington Heights," she said, as if the trick were obvious. "But my dad's from St. Louis, Senegal." She met Damian's eyes and didn't flinch. "We speak Wolof at home when he's tired, French when he's angry, English when he's practicing for meetings with people like you." "As charming as this is," Harold started, "what's your experience?" Priya's question was narrow, precise, not unkind. "I study linguistics," Ada said. "City college. I do community interpreting on weekends, housing clinics, health appointments. I tutor first-year French at night. I like the law." It came out almost embarrassed. "It's like a foreign language where all the verbs matter." Damian held her gaze. There were moments in business, he knew, when a room became a coin toss. You could reach for an old answer and find it smooth under your fingers, comfortable, riskless, and miss the one right move you'd be thinking about at 3 a.m. a decade from now. He hadn't built Helios to flip coins. "How would you render obligation d'moyens right now to an American corporate counsel who will sue me if you get it wrong?" he asked. She didn't blink. "Duty of best efforts," she said, "perfect and immediate, as opposed to obligation de résultat, which is a guarantee of outcome. You'll want the first for R&D milestones and the second, if they push for it, only in areas where you control all variables, never for third-party dependencies." She shifted her weight. "You'll also hear them mention clauses, leonines, as a joke they think you won't catch. You should. It means they're testing if you know you can't let them take the lion's share of profits while limiting their liability to €1 and a shrug." Harold shut his mouth. Priya's eyes flickered, then warmed like someone finding an ally in a crowd they hadn't expected. Damian checked his watch, opened his palm toward the conference table, and said, "You're hired for the morning." "I'm not dressed," she blurted, then realized how it sounded and flushed. "You're articulate," Damian said. "That's more than I can say for half the suits who'll be staring at us from across the table." She nodded, the mop bucket an awkward, ridiculous footnote to a hinge in her life. "Let me drop this with my dad," she said, lifting the tote. "I'll be right back." 5 minutes, Damian said. She met his eyes again, then vanished into the hall at a speed that made Harold shake his head. "Are we doing this?" he asked, sounding like a man who had witnessed a magic trick and was waiting for the rabbit to complain. "We're out of time," Damian replied. His voice was calm again, the panic transmuted into a cold silver focus. "And if she's half as good as that first answer, we just got luck we didn't deserve." The French delegation arrived at 9 on the dot, their coats foxed with street salt, their laughter soft and dismissive. A current that said, "New York is a stage, and we've been here before." There was the CEO, a man with a jaw like a lacquered shelf and a tie the color of Bordeaux. The CFO, sharp and quick, in a way that meant he had once been hungry and would be again. A counsel named Delacourt, whose glasses were designed to look expensive to people who knew better. And an engineer in a navy sweater with a quiet stare and a posture that bent toward the table like a question. Ada slid into the room with a small spiral notebook and a pen that had bitten into its cap. She had shed the sweater for a simple white blouse that made her look less like a student and more like a problem no one had seen coming. She took the seat at the corner of the table, the interpreter's chair, slightly back, face in the sightline of both sides, and set the notebook down like an anchor. "Messieurs, mesdames," Damian said, standing as they approached, voice warm enough for civility and cool enough for business. "Merci de nous accueillir," the French CEO replied, a smile like a knife laid politely on a napkin. He nodded to the others, shifting into rapid French that rolled like smoke over a river. "Nous sommes impatients de finaliser." "We appreciate the welcome," Ada translated, her tone crisp but soft, the music of New York bowing to the cadence of the Seine. "We're eager to finalize." They moved quickly into the choreography of it, the feints and parries, the compliments that were meant to be disarming, and the compliments that were meant to be disarming explosives. Ada rendered each line without effort, her French a spectrum, Parisian vowels when she needed to flatter the CEO's ears, clipped Lyonnais heat when Delacourt got slippery, the light West African lilt of people who learned French with their hands full, when she wanted to disarm them into thinking she was less than she was, She didn't just translate words, she watched. She listened to how silence sat in the shape of a mouth. She wrote down a clause number when someone said it too quickly, and when someone made a joke in the kind of juvenile verlan that men in suits used to remind themselves they once smoked behind gymnasiums. She didn't translate it at all. She'd let it land on the French side of the table like a stain they'd need to step around later. "You will insist on obligation de résultat for safety protocols," Delacourt said in French, halfway through a long sentence, the key tucked in like a thorn. "We insist on a guarantee of outcome for safety protocols," Ada said in English. And then, without moving her eyes from Damian, she added, "He's conflating ISO compliance with no-fault liability. He's about to propose a cap that removes consequential damages from their end in the event of a systemic failure. He expects we won't notice." Damian didn't look at her, not visibly, but he adjusted the angle of his pen on the table exactly 5 degrees, and Priya leaned in by a gesture so small that only 3 people in the room would have identified it as a strike. "That's not acceptable," Priya said smoothly. "If you insist on outcome guarantees, so will we, on your supply chain redundancy and your third-party code compliance. Full transparency, or we revert both to best efforts and price accordingly." The French CEO smiled with the graciousness of a man who had found the thorn in his own rose and decided to pretend it had been grafted there by a gardener he couldn't fire yet. He glanced at Delacourt, who updated his glasses without touching them. "We would be amenable," he said in English, slow and careful, because slow and careful is how you make Americans think you are sincere, to revising the safety clause to reflect mutual obligations. "Mutual obligations, no," Ada echoed in French, and in the echo there was a clean mirror. They took a break 90 minutes in. People had to seem human. Coffee appeared. Someone made a joke about croissants that would have been colonial if the person saying it were old enough to remember history as something other than an elevator pitch. The engineer in the navy sweater wandered to the window, hands in his pockets, eyes on a city he didn't know how to measure. Ada joined him, as if she were looking for light or air, or both. "You're from Toulouse?" she asked him gently in French. He blinked. "How did you—" "Your /r/ is Garonne," she said, smiling. "And you flinched when they mentioned ISO 26262 because you don't want to pretend you can guarantee electrical safety in a system you haven't laid hands on." He looked at her with respect then, the kind that starts with surprise and graduates to relief. "I'm Karim," he said. "And you are not the intern." "No," she said. "I'm the emergency." He laughed, a quick warm sound that made his whole face brighter. "If you hadn't caught Delacourt's trick, we'd be arguing about caps for 3 months." "If I hadn't caught it," she said, and lifted her coffee, "we'd be arguing about whose lawyers were better paid, and we'd both be correct." Across the room, Damian watched her from the corner of his eye and felt something inside him unclench. Not because the deal was safe, deals were never safe, but because competence like that, grace like that, made the world make sense again. He didn't indulge in inspiration. He didn't rehearse speeches to himself about talent rising. But he recognized in her the same click he felt the first time he went from slide deck to signed check. A sense that the right person in the right chair could tilt an entire room without ever raising her voice. They returned to the table. The French side pushed on data localization. Priya countered with a privacy framework that would have made a regulator nod in his sleep. Ada flowed between them, capturing not just terms but temperature, raising a syllable when the room needed heat and softening a vowel when it needed a way out. It was Delacourt who tipped his hand. He leaned toward his CEO and murmured, too quickly, too confidently, "On a quoi arrondir les angles et glisser un avenant plus tard." We'll smooth the edges and slip in an amendment later. A thing people say when they believe they've taught the room to trust them already. In English, Ida said, they're proposing a framework that looks complete but leaves a gap for a later addendum to insert price escalators through a cost of compliance carve-out. You'll want to lock that now. In French, she said politely, Could you elaborate on the mechanism you're proposing for updates in compliance costs? Our side would like to ensure full visibility. The engineer's eyes swung to her, then to his CEO. Karim didn't say a word, but the shape of his mouth changed, a line, flat and unhappy. The French CEO lifted his glass, set it down without drinking, and said, "Bien sûr," with a smile that had lost one of its teeth. By noon they had terms no one loved and everyone could live with, which, in Damian's private, quiet opinion, was the only truth you could trust in any room full of adults who knew what the world could do to a bottom line. They agreed to an MOU in both languages and a ratification timeline that would require his team to sleep in shifts for 3 weeks. And when the French delegation left in a gust of polite cologne and scarves that had learned to perform in crosswinds, Damian turned to the young woman who had made it possible. "You saved me a year," he said. "I saved you an afternoon," she replied, too honest to let him mythologize and too smart to accept less than he'd offer when he sat with the numbers later. "The rest we do on paper." "Lunch," Harold muttered, rubbing his eyes as if confused to find himself still standing inside hours he'd been sure would be a disaster. "Get the woman lunch." "I have lunch," she said, lifting her tote bag a little. "My dad's. He's on 16 right now. I need to bring it." "Bring him to me first," Damian said. "Please." She looked worried for the first time. Did something—" "Nothing's wrong," Damian said, and he understood then that in her life people didn't call you into rooms for nothing. You were summoned when things broke. So he made his voice as careful as he could. "I want to thank him for raising you, for being the kind of man who raises a woman like you." Her mouth pressed into a shape that wasn't a smile and wasn't not a smile. "He won't know what to do with that." "Neither will I," Damian said. "Let's be confused together." An hour later, in a maintenance corridor that smelled faintly of pine cleaner and resolved problems, Damian shook the hand of a man whose grip was sturdy and warm and incredulous. Moussa Diop had the posture of someone who remembered what a uniform felt like and the walk of someone who had told 100 small jokes so other people didn't feel sorry for him. He listened to his daughter tell the story in a tenfold speed of Wolof and French that left English in the dust. He blinked twice, said something to her in a low tone that made her eyes shine, and then looked at Damian with the dry gravity of a father negotiating with a future he couldn't yet see the shape of. "She's good," he said in English, "but you know that." "I do," Damian said. "She has school," Moussa said. "She studies. She works nights. She helps me when I am tired. She is not—" His hands opened, searching for the word that meant trophy and flag and pawn and luck and liability all at once. "She is not a favor," Damian said. Moussa's shoulders loosened a fraction. "Then what?" "A contractor," Damian said. "Paid, insured, with a scope that doesn't evaporate when I change my mind." He glanced at Ida, then back to Moussa. "I'd like her to help us through this deal, not just translate. Advise on tone, on subtext, on writing that holds in 2 languages without twisting in a storm. And if she says yes, I'd like the flexibility to build a role around her that doesn't have a name yet." Moussa looked at his daughter. 100 stories moved between them without syllables. The years of apartments that turned the same corners, the chalk of subway platforms, the steam of rice, the ache in shoulders that didn't get weekends. He nodded once and said, "You ask her, she answers. We try." "I'm not a favor," she repeated softly. "No," Damian said, and meant it. "You're leverage, and I mean that as the highest compliment I have." They drafted a short-term contract in 2 hours. Priya insisted on it, not because she didn't trust him, but because she trusted everyone else less. The number they put on the page made Ada worry a little and Moussa frown a lot, which meant it was probably right. She signed with a hand that shook and then steadied as the ink sank into the paper. Damian watched and felt something he rarely allowed on workdays, gratitude raw enough to feel like grief. Gratitude that the universe could still throw him a rope he hadn't woven himself. 2 weeks later, they went to Paris. It was a whirlwind. That was what people said about trips to cities that had built their names on making foreigners dizzy. It was a machine. Meetings with regulators and engineers and attorneys who believed that precedent was a form of oxygen. A factory floor tour where the smell of hot plastic mingled with the human pride of things that moved because someone had cared enough to make them move properly. A dinner that lasted 4 hours and 2 courses too long, during which a man who had once been relevant told a story about Mitterrand and looked around the table for respect, like a man searching his suit for his keys. At every table, in every doorway, on every staircase where men in suits told jokes to each other that had aged out of usefulness, Ada listened. She did not take up more space than she had, and somehow she took up the right amount of space in every room. She translated for Damian when she needed to, and she translated the world for him when she didn't. She stood with him by a window in the prefecture while rain silvered the Seine and explained in a whisper the difference between someone saying "je comprends" and someone saying "je vois." I understand versus I see. The first, a signal of empathy, the second, compliance. She taught him, gently, how to hear. On the third day, the sabotage arrived, quiet and dressed like help. An email forwarded by a friend to Harold with a PDF whose English was good enough to hurt. It alleged that Helios had steered a municipal pilot contract in Chicago by promising a consulting engagement to a city official's nephew. It was a lie. It had the shape of truth because truth's shape was easy to counterfeit when you were bored and angry and wanted to watch rich men move faster at their own table. The timing was surgical. Drop it right before a press breakfast. Watch it bloom. They gathered in a conference room that smelled like furniture and centuries. Harold paced. Priya read and reread every line as if she could make the vowels confess. Damian stood at the window and counted to a number that didn't exist. "This is deliberate," Priya said. "It's not a newspaper. It's a blog with a journalist's name on it. It's a press release disguised as a leak." "Translated from French," Harold added, squinting at phrasings you wouldn't have found in Chicago unless someone had packed them carefully. "And not Parisian French." "Lorraine," Ada said quietly, eyes moving like a metronome, "or Luxembourgish French, legalese borrowed from someone who drafts cross-border tax opinions." "Delacourt?" Harold snapped. "Not necessarily," she answered. "There's a sentence in here that uses caisse noire, like it belongs in a family kitchen. That's old slang. The person who wrote this learned to talk about money before he learned to talk about law." She lifted her face. "They want you to respond. They want to move the battlefield to a blog they can set on fire and then point at when regulators ask why the smoke smells so strange." "What do we do?" Harold asked. "We don't fight a rumor in a hallway," Damian said, the anger in him cooling into something far more useful. "We speak where the law listens." "Then we go to CNIL with a preemptive disclosure that someone is attempting to manipulate regulatory sentiment with disinformation," Priya said. "We bring our documentation. We don't shout. We show. And we tell the French side we're pausing the press breakfast to protect both parties from contamination," Damian added. "If they complain, they're telling us where to store our trust." Ada nodded, eyes bright with a pride that had nothing to do with herself. "I'll draft the French letter," she said. "Not the literal translation, the French letter, the one that respects their ceremony without sacrificing our spine." They delivered it that afternoon in a meeting room whose art made the idea of cost seem like a misunderstanding. The regulator listened, the way men listen when they're bored and you surprise them. He asked questions designed to test whether they knew what they were doing, and Priya answered with sentences that landed like well-tied knots. When he switched, for one moment, from ministry French to the looser idiom of a man who once lived in a building where the elevator didn't work, Ada switched with him and didn't translate the slip. She let two human beings talk like themselves. And when he returned to formality, she returned with him, like an instrument that had been tuned to both key and kindness. "Merci," he said at the end, and this time it didn't mean thank you for the meeting. It meant thank you for not treating me like a weapon. They left with something that wasn't a blessing and wasn't a threat, which again was the only thing you could trust. At night, in a hotel room that had the impersonal generosity of expensive things, Damian looked at the notes she'd left behind, terms and tones and tiny arrows that said, in pencil, "Careful here," and "Press here." He thought about all the people he paid to do jobs that looked like this and didn't feel like this. He thought about the fact that competence was not charity, but sometimes charity opened a door competence could walk through. "What's your tuition?" he asked her 2 days later, not as a proposition, but as an inventory. She lifted her eyebrows without looking up from her notebook. "Depends on the semester," she said. "Depends on whether I have to drop a class to cover rent. Depends on whether my dad can take overtime without his knee turning into a radio." "I'm offering a scholarship," he said. "No strings. Full ride. Finish your degree." "I'm offering a bill," she said calmly, keeping her pen on the page, "for services rendered." "You don't have to earn what you've already proven you deserve," he said. "No," she said, finally raising her face, and he saw the steel there that allowed her to be as gentle as she was. "But I want to, because the next girl like me may not meet you on a Tuesday before a deal you cared about, and I don't want your generosity to depend on your calendar. I want a line item you can point to, a program you can fund, whether you feel noble or not." "What program?" he asked. "A small one," she said. "Today, for the children of the people who clean your floors and fix your elevators and guard your doors, for the girls who speak 3 languages and think none of them will ever buy them a chair at the table, for the boys who translate for their mothers at the clinic and don't realize that's called responsibility, tuition, book stipends, one-on-one mentorship, someone to tell them what the difference between je comprends and je vois is when the world gets loud." He felt that click again, the one that turned charity into infrastructure. "Write it," he said. "I already did," she said, sliding a single sheet across the table. The header was plain. The budget was austere. The argument was perfect. They launched the pilot after the deal signed. The French CEO shook Damian's hand with a precision that hid both relief and resentment. Delacour pretended to nod to Priya, and somehow nodded at the floor instead. Karim hugged Ada in a way that would have counted as a small scandal in his office, and didn't in this one because gratitude was supposed to be invisible, but sometimes it wasn't. Back in New York, Helios carved out a budget line the size of a 1-bedroom apartment and named it without naming it. They ran the program through the Helios Foundation because paperwork needed homes. They hired a woman who had grown up in the projects and now ran a nonprofit that taught kids how to argue with juries without raising their voices. The language of the brochures was designed to make it sound both inevitable and new. A month into the summer, Musa twisted his knee on a midnight shift. He didn't complain because men like him practiced silence like a skill. The next morning, when he limped into a supervisory meeting where no one noticed the limp Ada noticed, she told Damian. Damian went to the building manager, then the vendor, then the contract itself. He found the clause where someone had saved $1 with a word, the way people save dollars with words, and he crossed it out. He renegotiated. He added hazard pay for overnight hours and protected time for medical appointments. He didn't do it to be good. He did it because the next time a knee snapped in the dark, it might be attached to the person who had saved him a year twice in one morning. And because that logic had always been true, whether he remembered it or not. When Ada walked across a stage 18 months later to receive a diploma, he sat with Musa and shouted like a man who had learned how to be loud late in life. The program they'd built had already pushed 5 kids through their first year without a C. 2 of them were studying French because a girl had made it sound like a sword and a lullaby at the same time. After the ceremony, under a sky that couldn't decide whether to hold rain or give it away, he handed her a thick envelope. She opened it, frowned, and pulled out a letter with a crest on top that made her take one small step backward in shock. "Geneva?" she breathed. "Conference interpreting," he said. "A master's. The Sorbonne was an option, but Geneva is—" where the rules are made, she finished. There are no strings, he said, then smiled a little, except the ones you tie around my throat when I get too attached to the sound of my own voice. She stood there holding an entire map in an envelope and looked at him like a student and a peer and a woman who understood he couldn't give her the world, only choices. She closed the envelope carefully and slid it back into his hand. "Not yet," she said. He blinked. "Not ever?" "Oh, maybe ever," she said, laughing quietly. "But not yet. There's a department here with a name that doesn't exist. Cultural intelligence, diplomatic operations, I don't care what you call it, that decides how a company sounds when it's scared and how it tells the truth when it has to. I want to build that." She tilted her head. "And I want to build the program for the kids until it runs without us. Then I'll leave you, and you'll say something dramatic in the press that makes me sound like a saint when I am just stubborn." "Director of Strategic Language and Culture," he said before he knew he was speaking. "Reporting directly to me, budget autonomy, decent chairs." She squinted. "Chairs? You'll spend all day telling people to listen," he said dryly. "You might as well be comfortable while you do it." She took the envelope back and tucked it into her bag, where it sat beside a spiral notebook chewed at the corners, and a pen that wrote better than most men he knew spoke. She offered him her hand. He took it.